Excellent. All right, welcome everybody to this week's simulation-based science colloquium. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me briefly point to our website in case you haven't seen it before. So if you go to csbscommunity.nl past events, you'll see all our past events so far with the recording. So if you're interested in modeling the labor market, the COVID-19 pandemic, or interdisciplinarity, take a look. What's missing as of yet is a talk on climate. And I have a feeling that no simulation-based science colloquium can be complete without one, for two reasons. First, obviously, simulations are integral to climate science. But second, the climate crisis is also the defining issue of our time. And what we do now, what we do in the next decades, will determine the conditions of life for all current generations and all future generations, all future life forms. So it's somehow we ended up here, but here we are. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Jonathan Donges today, who not only has done and is doing very exciting work on modeling tipping elements in Earth's climate, where nonlinearity is not our friend, but also social tipping processes that can help us achieve the rapid decarbonization that is required to stabilize Earth's climate. Dr. Jonathan Donges is a co-leader of the Future Lab of Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene at the world-renowned Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where he also is a leader of a group focused on whole Earth system analysis and a co-speaker of the COPAN collaboration. He holds research positions at the Stockholm Resilience Center and is a visiting researcher at the Environmental Institute at Princeton. And he has a PhD in theoretical physics and has published widely on nonlinear dynamics, complex networks, complex systems analysis, Earth system analysis, socio-ecological systems. So I'm very excited to hear what he's going to talk about today. So Jonathan, without further ado, take it away.
Great, thanks a lot for that kind introduction and for inviting me this afternoon to speak here. So I hope that I'm the guy who stands between you and the weekend. It's like let's say, right? So I hope it's not too boring. So let's see. So I hope this works. Can you see the right screen, like the full slide, right?
We can see the current slide and the next slide.
Oh, so that's what I was okay. That's what I was. Now it should work, right? Yes. Can you see the full slide? Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to talk today about modeling, simulation modeling, mainly of cascading interactions in climate and social tipping dynamics. And as Fabian said, talk about the risks of this, but also the opportunities, particularly on the social tipping side. And the talk will be, the risks will be mainly the focus in the climate system, the natural climate system, that work that we do, the potentials on the social tipping sphere. And I'll also conclude with talking a little bit about the whole Earth system analysis perspective and work that we are doing there. So let me briefly introduce where this is the Albert Einstein Science Campus on Telegraph in Potsdam, where our institute is situated and where we're doing our work. And it's kind of in a way it's an iconic place because it's a glacial moraine that was created by the last advances of the Fennoscandian ice sheet 20,000 years ago, when glaciers from Scandinavia reached down to Berlin and covered Potsdam and Berlin with more than a kilometer of ice. And what is left of that is what this institute is built on. And this paleoclimate perspective, I think it's always quite important to put the current developments in global change into context and to really that's why I chose this as the entry point for that talk. So that's also a maybe for some of you well-known visualization, but I find it always quite impressive how global warming took us from the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago to the Holocene in 10,000 years, about 2 to 3 degree warming, then the Holocene was relatively stable with a very slight cooling trend, which would have taken the Earth system to the next ice age, would it have not been for human perturbations that you can see here already in the Paleoclimate data towards the end of that data set that lead to a rapid warming already in the observational record, a warming of compared to pre-industrial conditions of about 1 degree by now, 1 degree Celsius. And so again, if we look into the future projections, even scenarios which are not as extreme as the RCP 8.5 scenario, take the RCP 4.5 or 6.0, which are closer to what is currently expected from current policy commitments. They cause a very large but also rapid warming, which is I think quite important to see that it's really not just about the magnitude of warming. Is it 2 degrees within the Paris Agreement's range? Is it 3 degrees or 4 degrees? But it's also about 100 times faster in any case than any natural warming that has happened in the past millions of years, and certainly 100 times faster than the one after the last glacial maximum. Now, this unprecedented forcing that humans have put on the Earth system has the potential to trigger nonlinear processes in the system. These are called tipping elements. The tipping elements, I'll talk a little bit in more detail about that in a second, but they are large-scale subsystems of the Earth system that can undergo large change with very problematic impacts for human societies, even if just a small temperature threshold is crossed. So these systems, they respond sensitively to small perturbations across thresholds. And not only that, there are these tipping elements, some of which are quite well understood, some less, but there are also risks of cascading interactions between these tipping elements. That means that domino effects where one tipping element could tip the other could be triggered, there is evidence that such developments have been triggered in paleoclimate, and this is something that I'll also go into. Finally, we are now in the Anthropocene. I mean, this unprecedented forcing and Earth system response shows that it's a new, it has been proposed as a new geological epoch. And this really, because human forcing is so important here, it's of equal importance to the natural Earth system processes now. This calls for a whole Earth system, for an integrated feedback perspective where human Earth system interactions are studied. And this also holds for the tipping perspective that I have taken in the past years in my research. And that's why we want to also study interactions between tipping processes in both the climate and the social systems of the planet, of course, starting with a more conceptual perspective. And only understanding these types of interactions can actually help us to get a better understanding of this landscape that has been put up in this paper, which is really, this landscape is much more of a cartoon of a large high-dimensional stability landscape that one could envision the Earth system to develop in. But I think the key message is that what human perturbations so far have done is to push the Earth system far out of its Holocene equilibrium range and has destabilized the system. So the system is currently moving on what has been called, but has been also debated, a hothouse Earth trajectory towards much warmer temperatures. And what is needed is Earth system stewardship that leads to a stabilization of this development in some tolerable regime, for example, in line with the Paris Agreement and sustainable development goals. So that's kind of the big picture of what we are striving for understanding, or the whole community is, in a sense. Now, let me go a bit more into the tipping dynamics in the climate system. And that's the first part of the talk. And there are, as I said, some of these elements are better understood, some are less, but what is clear is that there are different you can group them by qualitatively different types of tipping elements. There are nonlinear processes in ice sheets in the cryosphere, so including the large continental ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland, mountain glaciers, but also sea ice. There are, of course, the large atmospheric and oceanic circulation systems, including the ocean, Atlantic Ocean meridional overturning circulation, or the jet stream in the atmosphere. And there are also ecosystems which can show these nonlinearities. For example, the Amazon rainforest has been quite a prominent example that has been discussed, but also permafrost or boreal forests and coral reefs. Now, what is now a very important property of these tipping elements are the so-called critical thresholds or tipping points. And for the tipping elements, if you look into this in a more process-based picture and look into different tipping elements in more detail, you find that, for example, here for the Atlantic meridional overcirculation, the tipping, the key forcing parameter is actually the freshwater forcing in the North Atlantic. And if this becomes too large, a so-called fold bifurcation can be crossed, and the system can move irreversibly into a different regime, which is a weaker circulation. And currently a weakening of the AMOC, a strong weakening that is unprecedented in the past 2,000 years, I think has been detected. But it's not clear whether the system is just moving downwards on this upper branch here, or if it's already falling down. So this is just to put the current development into this very simple picture, which is of course not reflecting reality completely. For other systems like the Amazon rainforest, there also exist these types of typical bifurcation or typical phase transition plots, and where, however, different variables, of course, play a role. For the rainforest, precipitation is an important control parameter that determines whether the system is, for example, in a forested state or in a savanna state, or even in a grassland state. And a lot of research is, of course, has been devoted in the past decades to looking into these processes in much more detail. And what I want to do is, first to show that to put the critical thresholds of the tipping elements into context with this development that I showed in the beginning. It's quite illustrative to do that. So the critical control parameters that determine the thresholds of the tipping elements, they can be translated to a temperature anomaly, so global mean surface warming anomaly, to put it in context with global warming projections. So, for example, one can see that a lot of the tipping elements have the lower part of the uncertainty range for their critical threshold starting already at quite low levels of global warming, around 1 degree of global warming for Western Arctic ice sheet, Greenland, alpine glaciers, coral reefs, for example. And this is about at the level of warming where we are now. And of course, this is consistent with reports during the past years that have actually reported, for example, that the Western Arctic ice sheet might have already crossed irreversible tipping points, based also on observational data. Other tipping elements have uncertainty ranges which start at significantly larger temperatures. For example, here the second cluster, which includes ecosystems and circulations, and even another cluster which starts at even higher temperatures. But one should note that projected global warming, even within the century, can reach up to 4 or 5 degrees, which would put the system already in the zone where these tipping elements here, the second cluster, is at risk. And in centuries to come, even after that, so the 22nd, 23rd century, etc., these higher temperatures could be reached, putting other tipping elements here at risk as well. And one of these tipping elements I want to go into a bit more detail here, the cryosphere tipping elements, because we happen to have a very strong ice modeling group that I collaborate with at PIC, and I wanted to go into a bit more detail here to show you how this is done in a simulation modeling mode. So the Antarctic ice sheet is a very impressive system because it is huge and has been has been present very likely in the Earth system for the past 20 or 30 million years. So for a very, very long time, it has been very stable despite large climate fluctuations that have happened in that time. But this system has been very stable. But now one can show, and we've shown in this paper in Nature, that with very detailed experiments, that this system can actually be completely melted down by anthropogenic forcing within the next couple of thousand years, which seems like a long time. But what is important here is that it's really a long-term commitment that is at stake here. So that means that even warming that we cause in this century could lead to a loss of large parts of this ice sheet within the next thousands of years, and without a simple possibility to stop that from happening, right? So it's this long-term commitment, things that we cause in the next decades that could have millennia of a legacy. And what we do here is we use the dynamic ice sheet model PISM, which is really a large system of nonlinear partial differential equations, which is solved and to simulate the dynamics of the ice, including the flow of the ice, but also the thermodynamics of the ice, so the temperature, distribution, friction, stress tensor, etc. So it's really complicated beast, but it's quite well controlled by observational data. And what we find is that if we now, okay, what has happened? Now there's a video actually. That's you can see for different levels of global warming how in equilibrium after a long time what parts of the ice sheet are lost. So now we are at 3 degrees of global warming, and this is what after a very long time would be the state of the ice sheet, right? So this is always the long-term commitment given at that level of global warming. So now 5 degrees is a level that we could reach still within the century, and going now to even larger levels. Now we see that while at about 2 degrees of warming, the West Antarctic ice sheet has been lost. Now there's a strong threshold here, a large loss around 7 to 8 degrees of global warming, where a large part of the East Antarctic ice sheet is lost. And one should really mention that these are very large sea level commitments that are connected to that. So let me go to, now not much is happening anymore. There's just a few glaciers left on the mountains of Antarctica. We look into this in a very systematic way in this hysteresis analysis. We, as before, as was shown in the video, we vary global warming translated, of course, to a regional surface air temperature change very, very slowly, and run the system into equilibrium. So we can really trace the hysteresis of the system. Hysteresis is something that many nonlinear systems show. It basically means the system is path dependent. Many complex systems have that property. It means that if you force the system in one way and then you reverse the forcing, the system doesn't return on the same path to its old state, but it can actually it can go return on a different path, and it might be that you have to reverse the forcing much stronger to get back to the initial state. And this is what's happening here. So you can see that the ice sheet is actually again, the West Antarctic ice sheet is lost at about 2 degrees of global warming. And then another large threshold happens between 6 to 8 degrees of global mean temperature. So that's the lower scale. The upper scale is regional surface air temperature, so it's easy to confuse. But the important message is that the West Antarctic ice sheet could cause already several meters of sea level rise, global mean sea level rise, so up to 3 meters. While the East Antarctic ice sheet in total has up to about 50 meters of global mean sea level rise, which is of course huge. And it would take many millennia to manifest, but it could be irreversibly triggered at some point in the relatively near future. Maybe not this whole range of sea level rise, but a large part of it. And then finally on the hysteresis, this really shows that if the Antarctic ice sheet is lost really after say 10-degree global temperature change, reversing the ice sheet to its current state would really mean a cooling of the Earth to -2 or -3 degrees below the pre-industrial value. That means going back to temperatures that are typical for ice ages, right? So it means that under current conditions, the Antarctic ice sheet actually cannot regrow to its current state. It's actually, in a way, it's a legacy of the ice age cycles that have taken place in the Earth system over the past millions of years. It's really a long-term legacy. Okay, so that's kind of a bit more detail on this one tipping element, and happy also to take more questions on the modeling later if you're interested. Now, an interesting property that these tipping elements have is not only that they have these nonlinearities, and crossing thresholds could potentially cause large impacts to human societies, but they can also they participate in climate feedbacks, and they can actually lead tipping of these elements can actually lead to amplified global warming, and this is what's happening for what we've shown to happen for the cryosphere tipping elements, the Greenland ice sheet, the Western Arctic ice sheet, and the mountain glaciers, and the sea ice, the summer sea ice, Arctic summer sea ice. And what we show is that if these elements are lost, there's a large regional warming, particularly, of course, in the polar regions. But there is also a quite significant global additional warming commitment due to this ice loss, and this is up to 0.4 degrees of warming, which might not seem too much given these large values that we've talked about, but it's actually the order of magnitude of the difference between the 1.5 and 2 degree Paris targets, which is debated a lot, right? So in some communities, the climate debate is really about 1/10 of a degree Celsius. So we think this is quite important, and just shows how there are these positive feedbacks that can be triggered also with a long-term legacy by humans now and within the next decades. Now I would like to go a bit more into the risks of tipping cascades and domino effects. So what have we done there? There's a real challenge. I mean, there is this risk, a potential risk of domino effects, has been pointed out for quite a long time now, and there has also been some studies, including, for example, expert elicitation on these things, but there hasn't been a dynamic modeling, using a risk assessment using a simulation model. And why is this? This is because these tipping processes, many of these tipping elements, they are not yet fully represented in state-of-the-art Earth system models. So the large climate models that are used for the IPCC reports, for the CMIP, the Climate Model Intercomparison Project, they are some of them represent some of the tipping elements, for example, the AMOC, the Atlantic overturning circulation, but many of them don't. They certainly don't represent all of them. And there are large uncertainties. There are considerable uncertainties still in the parameters of the tipping elements, including the critical threshold. You've seen this graph before. There are very large uncertainties where these critical thresholds actually are, and also in the timescales on which the tipping elements evolve, but also in their interactions. So in the strengths of the interactions, the relative strengths, but also even in the sign of the interaction. Sometimes you don't know whether a certain interaction is amplifying or dampening. But there is actually quite, for the tipping elements that we included in our analysis, there is actually quite a lot of evidence that they are tipping elements. So this is at least something that we take for granted in this analysis. And now, yeah, the final argument is that the complex Earth system models, they are really too slow for large-scale ensemble simulations, for Monte Carlo simulations that we need to cover these uncertainties, to actually do a risk analysis. Because we cannot use a model that needs a day to compute a year in the model or so, right? We need a model which is relatively fast to do this, to sample all these uncertainties. And what we have developed in a number of papers is a network approach, a complex networks approach to model the interactions of tipping elements. And it's about the network resilience or two cascading dynamics. And what we do is that we use these, we have nonlinear dynamics, nonlinear differential equation on each node of the network, describing this double fold, this iconic double fold bifurcation that describes many of the climate tipping elements in an at least qualitative way. And we couple these nonlinear differential equations with a linear coupling term and a complex network topology. So that's already the basic approach. And then we study if under which conditions the tipping of one certain node can actually lead to large tipping cascades in the whole network. And they can look like this, for example. So one node tipping leads to tipping of two, for example, in this case. Now, what we do is we focus in this analysis on 4 tipping elements, as I said again, where it's quite well established that they are actually tipping elements. So there is, of course, always debate but there's a quite good consensus that these have these nonlinearities, or at least it's the uncertainties are not extremely large in that respect. And these include here the Greenland ice sheet, the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the Amazon rainforest, and also the West Antarctic ice sheet, and their interactions. So they are interacting, for example, via increased freshwater flux. So melting of Greenland can weaken the AMOC because more freshwater is flowing into the North Atlantic, or weakening of the AMOC can in turn change the precipitation patterns over the Amazon, which in turn can tip the Amazon, etc. And what we do is we propagate uncertainties in all these parameters using a large-scale Monte Carlo ensemble. So we have actually about 10 million simulations that we run for the results that I will show in a second. And we have a network approach that allows to identify the roles of tipping elements in cascades in this model. And what we find, for one, is that the ice sheets are often initiators of cascades. This is why this domino, this red domino, is quite large, particularly for Greenland. So Greenland is, in many cases, when Greenland tips, a lot of other tipping elements follow. And this is because of the specific location in the network, of course, and of the quite strong interactions that it has to other tipping elements. But also we find that the AMOC is a predominant transmitter of cascades. So it can transmit cascades, for example, from the northern to the southern hemisphere, or from Greenland to the tropics, for example, because it connects really all these 3 major, the 2 hemispheres and the tropics with the polar regions. And finally, we also find that when we do this risk analysis, that the effective critical threshold temperatures are actually decreasing for most tipping elements due to the interactions. So this means that the interactions between tipping elements, they tend to destabilize the system overall. They are not stabilizing overall, despite for Greenland, where there's actually a stabilizing effect, but it's really weak because there are very large uncertainties, as you can see here in panel B. So for Greenland, for all the others, this is a destabilizing interaction. And this is quite important that we were able to show this, because there have been some claims before that the interactions might actually stabilize the whole system. But here we show it's actually only maybe true for Greenland, but not for the other tipping elements. And second major finding is that that's the lower panels here. The risk for tipping cascades is actually increases very strongly between 2 to 3 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial conditions. That's kind of this region that separates the stabilized Earth regime with a low global warming from this what I call here quote unquote the hothouse Earth regime. And this risk increases strongly in this area, which is of course exactly the area that the Paris Climate Agreement is targeting, because it attempts to stay below these 2 degrees. And also, even more importantly, maybe we find that the uncertainty in this risk is actually largest in this policy relevant warming range between 1 to 3 degrees. This is where this is thin ice. So if we are in this range between 1 degree global warming, which is actually now, which is what we have already now, and 3 degrees, it's what we get if current policy agreements are fulfilled, which are of course not sufficient. And then we are on this thin ice. So there's still quite a risk, according to our analysis at least, that tipping points are crossed and tipping cascades could be triggered in the long term. Okay, so with that, I would like to move towards more positive angle and ask for social tipping points for decarbonization from empirical evidence to modeling. So it has been argued and shown that a very rapid decarbonization with unprecedentedly fast rates of socio-economic change is needed to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. Effectively, this has been called the carbon law. Emissions have to be reduced by 50%. They have to be cut in half every decade until 2050. Until 2050, a net zero in emissions is reached. And this exponential pathway, exponential decrease, the question is how this can actually be reached, given that so far policy implementations, etc., have not really been very effective. And there's a whole number of papers that emerging and that already have been published in the past 1, 2, 3 years that propose a positive social tipping points as a potential mechanism for bringing about such change. So one can see this as studies that look into social tipping as a particular type of social change, which could help to lead to these very fast rates of decarbonization. And there's papers from Dawn Farmer's group and Cameron Hepburn in Oxford, from David Tabara, from Tim Lenton, and also from our group, and also others. Now, overall, this fits into the scope of an increasing overall interest in social-ecological tipping dynamics. This is from a review paper with Manjana Milkovite that I've been also part of, that we published 2 or 3 years ago, where we did this detailed literature analysis, and one can really show how the tipping point and also social tipping point concepts take up in the past 20 years or so. And so there's already quite a body of research to build on. What our angle particularly has been that with the work with Ilona Otto on the social tipping dynamics for stabilizing Earth's climate by 2050 has been that really realizing that these rates of emissions reductions that are needed to reach the Paris Agreement, they have to decrease exponentially, or the rate has to increase exponentially for the next decades, but also these rates of emission reduction, they are unprecedented in the 20th century. So even large crises like the collapse of communism or the Second World War, they have led only, quote unquote, to maybe 6% of emissions reductions. And recently, the Corona pandemic has given us another example. So the COVID pandemic in 2020 has led to what has been estimated to -6 to -8 decrease in emissions compared to 2019, which is already larger than what we have computed here for the Second World War. But importantly, the rates in the years after 2030 or so, they would have to be even larger every year, just to put this the scope of the challenge here. And so we did actually an expert elicitation to collect some empirical evidence for the social tipping dynamics. That is, of course, again, to mention, the concept is of course not completely new, but it's related a lot to different types of social change and to concepts that like societal transformations, revolutions, collapse, and resilience that have been studied for a long time in the social sciences, and also partly interdisciplinary sciences. Now, we have been asked a lot of experts, what are the social tipping elements that could initiate a socially and economically disruptive transformation leading to a complete decarbonization by 2050. We've sent this questionnaire to a group of over 1,000 researchers and practitioners across the world, and we've received about more than 100 responses, and have done a systematic analysis of this. And what we found out of that, we were able to identify 5 clusters of processes that are key, that the experts said were key elements or social tipping elements for bringing about this rapid decarbonization. And they include for the energy and production and storage system, of course, the human settlements, but also financial markets, and then social norms and values, education system, and the information feedbacks. And they've also identified so-called social tipping interventions. So these are actual points where where the disruptive dynamics in these elements can be triggered. And these include, for example, the disclosure of greenhouse gas informations much more in a much more comprehensive way than is currently done in the information feedbacks cluster, or divestment from fossil fuels in the financial market cluster. And that's particularly that example is something that I will come to in the modeling part of the social tipping elements. So now an example for another type of cluster, one could argue, here is the recent dynamics of the Fridays for Future movement that we took from German survey data in this paper, where we can see that the Fridays for Future movement targeted particularly the social norms. So the norms of how important is actually to care for future society, for the future of your children, your grandchildren, and for the deeper future compared to the present. And they have been arguing a lot along those lines. So this is kind of fitting into, I'm just jumping back real quick, it's fitting into this cluster 4, the social norms and value system. And they have really pulled the trigger of this intervention, revealing the moral implications of burning fossil fuels to a large degree, just to put this into context. What we've seen in this data is that in Germany, there has been a very large increase, at least until the start of the corona pandemic, that people thought that the environment is an important problem, increased from about 10% fluctuating for 20 years up to 60%. And also the percentage of German voters that said they would vote for the Green Party increased accordingly, very strongly. Not up to 60%, but up to 25%, which is also unprecedented in the past. Now, this was just also for illustration. So going a bit back to the theory, the social tipping elements are systems, like in the climate case, where a small intervention or small perturbation can have a large effect. And the concept has deep roots, so it's not new. It goes back to people like Schelling and Granovetter, great sociologists. And as we have shown in this recent literature review, for example. And there's evidence for these effects, for social tipping-like effects in data and models of public opinion, social norms, investment choices on financial markets, etc. But it's also not yet fully established that that a lot of systems have the potential for these social tipping points, right? So it's really an open research field. And there's also even recent experimental evidence from behavioral experiments for what has been called by some people like a Pareto principle in social tipping, namely that about, let's say, 20 to 30% of a minority of actors can change the majority's attitudes or behavior if this is a committed minority. And that's a finding that also holds in other studies. So all these things come together. And what we did in a paper that we are currently developing for ecological economics, actually it's under review there, we are looking into the key differences of social tipping points and climate tipping, because this is also key when it comes to the modeling. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but just mention that one of these key differences is, of course, human agency and intentionality. So there's social systems are complex adaptive systems, and that this is different from how an ice sheet behaves or how an ocean circulation behaves, of course. So we are fully aware of that. There is, of course, a key difference is that social systems, they have social structure, and networks are of many different kinds are very important. There is, including, again, the adaptive ability to consciously create and destroy links or interconnections between systems, or even create new nodes in the network. So, for example, new institutions, so groups or organizations. And this means that tipping can either occur on a given network, for example, by spreading of a certain contagious spreading of some opinion or technology, that's panel A, or it can also happen by changing the network structure altogether, that would be panel B. This is also different from many of the physical climate tipping elements, like ice sheets again and ocean circulation, say. But of course, ecosystems, they show some analogies in their behavior. And if you look into ecosystem tipping points in more detail, you will also have to look at food webs and other types of ecological interactions. And by evolutionary processes, for example, there can also be creation of new nodes or agents in ecological systems. So there's always this, it comes out of the study as well, that ecological systems in many ways are intermediate. They are sitting between the physical climate tipping elements and the social. Also, temporal scales and spatial scales are quite different between these systems. This is shown by this graph here from the Tim Lenton paper from 2020, but I think a bit more, maybe a bit more clearly in this graph, where it's evident that, I mean, one thing is that the climate tipping elements is that they tend to reside mainly on larger spatial scales, and also they have longer manifestation times, so they take a longer time to tip, while the social tipping points, they tend to be on smaller scales, both in space and time. And finally, there's also the issue of complexity. So again, social tipping processes occur in complex adaptive systems, as opposed to the complex but non-adaptive physical climate systems. So this means that an ice sheet somehow cannot adapt or anticipate in a certain sense. Of course, it changes, but that in a certain sense, then the social system would. And also social systems can exhibit comparatively greater complexity. So in the number of drivers of different processes that come together, multidimensionality, more complex mechanisms, multi-level cross-scale dynamics, and also more complex and diverse resulting pathways of tipping processes. And of course, the diversity and heterogeneity of actors and elements, inequalities, etc., makes and the unpredictability that resides from that. And also kind of an ultimate unpredictability, in the sense that it's really not clear what a final state or what even a stable state means in a social system, what a final stable state actually means, but or even whether changes in the tipping process would be normatively considered positive or negative by different actors. All these things are much more fluid in a way than in the physical climate system. And what we propose, based on this analysis of the differences, is that a network perspective, a complex network modeling perspective on social tipping seems very promising, because for one, social systems and also social ecological systems can be described as network-like structures, and have been described as such in simulation modeling for sure. And then we can then build on that and define a social system as a tipping element if very generally under certain critical conditions. So if the system is in a critical state, a small change in the system or its environment can lead to a large change in the system. So and this can happen via contagious spreading effects, for example, on the network, but also via a reorganization of the network by a change even in the network topology. So this is, of course, very, very general, very broad definition, but we can use it in actual simulation models. And this is the approach that we focus on is adaptive co-evolutionary network modeling, but it's actually one can also view it as a special view on agent-based or multi-agent models that where the network, there's an emphasis on the dynamic network structures. And the main idea is that there's a feedback that we want to cover between the state of the nodes, the properties of the nodes, and the structure of the network. So the state of the nodes can affect the topology, and the topology can affect the state of the nodes. And this is something that happens, for example, in opinion formation, but also in epidemic spreading, where people who are infected maybe, or people who are not infected, avoid people who are infected. And all this has been studied a lot already, so we can build on something. But the new idea here is to relate this much more explicitly to the concept of social tipping. So to relate the words of adaptive network modeling and the statistical physics of complex networks to the concept of social tipping, and also bringing this together with relevant social science concepts in our collaborations with social scientists. So as Fabian said, I'm a theoretical physicist by training, but we collaborate a lot now in my groups with social scientists, of course, on these issues. And one thing that we did that I want to quite quickly cover here is a refinement of Granovetter's threshold model of social activation as a numerical modeling tool. And what we did is that we used the Watts model on cascades in networks from 2002. It's kind of a paradigmatic model on cascades in networks. We used this as a microfoundation for Granovetter's threshold model. And we were able to show also analytically using mathematics that this Watts cascading model is actually a microfoundation of the Granovetter threshold model. And our extension allows us also to use it a bit more in a more operational way, say for modeling social tipping in the context of climate, as I will show on the next slide. But what is important is that we actually distinguish that now nodes can not only be active or not active as in Granovetter threshold model, but they can also be distinguished into potentially active nodes, certainly active nodes, and the ones that are never active. So we have nodes that are always active. They can trigger the system, and the question is whether there are enough. If a share of instigators or active nodes becomes large enough, as you can see in this bifurcation diagram, a tipping point can be crossed, leading to a state where a much larger share of the network is active. So this is a classic tipping point that emerges from this underlying network dynamics, and very, very consistent with the Granovetter threshold model. Now, what we use this for in a study that is currently in preparation is that we relate this to the question of under which conditions social tipping can lead to larger levels of climate action, of climate awareness in the population. And key concepts here are concern about climate change, anticipation of future impacts with a focus here on sea level rise, and social tipping interventions. And what we do is we combine a model, this extended Granovetter model of social tipping, with detailed sea level rise projections under different global warming scenarios, population elevation distributions, and cross-national climate change concern data from social science surveys. And the population elevation distribution is important because it can help us to determine under which sea level rise level how many people would be certainly active. So we assume here that people who will be affected by sea level rise at where they live, after a certain time, they would become certainly active about climate change in this model. So this is how we determine the share of potentially active people in the population. And the people who are potentially active is determined by the climate change concern, about which we have data from social science surveys. So that's panel A. This shows the share of the potentially acting population based on this social science survey data, which is, for example, in some countries like India here or Brazil, this is quite high, while in continental Europe, this is more intermediate, more 50%, and in some countries like Russia, it's relatively low, or Australia. Now, what we find is that in this model world, the climate change concern, increasing climate change concern, increases the overall tipping potential. So it makes the system easier to tip. The anticipation, so an increased anticipation time horizon for sea level rise impacts that the people have. So we say, okay, people look into the future, let's say 100 years, 200 years, and they want to understand, okay, do we expect that our homestead, our city will be flooded by then or not? Right, to put it drastically, this is what the anticipation time horizon says. And what we then find is that increasing anticipation time horizon moves the system closer to a tipping point. So it actually moves us closer to this tipping point in the Granovetter model. And while the concern just makes the system overall more critical. So there's a difference here between overall criticality and the closeness to the tipping point. And what finally, we find that interventions, which could be, for example, social movements or the sudden salience of certain political issues or climate extreme events, these interventions, they can kick the system into a tip state. And the criticality of the system determines basically how easy it is for these, let's say, stochastic events to make the system tip into this more active state. And important take-home messages from these are that first, the tipping arises here from multiplicative factors, not from a single control parameters. So there's climate concern involved, there's anticipation of future sea level involved, there's these interventions, there is also heterogeneity between all these countries. And we also find that noise-induced tipping as a pathway for this social change seems to be more promising in the model than the parameter-induced tipping. So noise-induced tipping is the case that a stochastic event, like again a large climate extreme event, or a sudden, let's say, the rise of a certain social movement about climate change would tip the system, rather than hoping that some tipping point will be crossed, right? So conceptually, we think this is quite important to emphasize. Now, a final example, and I go through that quickly because I know my time is running out, is we've used this approach also for more specific social tipping dynamics in divestment from fossil fuels. And the motivation is, of course, that there's a lot of carbon needs to stay in the ground for the Paris Climate Agreement to be met, but a lot of this is also owned and funded by private investors. So if private investors change their behavior, the hope is of the fossil fuel divestment movement is that also a lot of this carbon could actually stay in the ground for economic reasons, for financial market reasons. There is quite a strong dynamics in the divestment movements that we have observed, can be observed from the data that the fossil-free NGO provides. A lot of big organizations, pension funds, governments, universities have committed to divest their investments from fossil fuel companies. But the problem is there's, of course, a lot of capital in the market that goes back and buys these assets. So that so far, it's debated whether this actually has a real effect on the real fossil fuel economy. But certainly it has a kind of a more abstract effect. And the model includes that we study, it includes a representative fossil fuel firm. It includes a social network of investors that exchange their beliefs about future climate policy via social learning, building here on the adaptive voter model. And this is coupled to a co-evolving agent-based model of trading fossil fuel stocks on a financial market. And there are two types of agents: profit maximizing investors, so that's kind of the business as usual investors, and then there are socially responsible investors, which would like to divest from fossil fuel if they expect that climate policy will come in the future. And this is kind of I jump over that, a bit more detail on the model. There are two main takeaways from this model. One is that we find in this model world, at least we find social tipping points in this divestment movement where the overall cumulative carbon emission can actually drop quite significantly, this is kind of the overall outcome that is produced by this representative fossil fuel firm. So there are these tipping points, for example, when you vary the share of socially responsible investors. This is panel C. So when this share of socially responsible investors is varied across kind of, again, this Pareto type number, 20 to 40%, then the remaining carbon budget, the remaining emissions, go down even to zero, because this company becomes bankrupt before it can emit a lot. And it doesn't go to zero, but it goes to the carbon budget here. And the key message here is that moral investors have agency. So only a small share of them is required to tip the system, relatively small share, right? You don't need 60 or 80% under quite broad variation of other parameters, but a smaller share, well below 50%, is sufficient. Another message is that the trading frequency, for example, how fast the financial markets are compared to the social interactions, is quite important. So the faster the trading is compared to the social interactions, the less sustainable the system is, because, and this is also, I think, quite in view of algorithmic trading, etc., this is quite an important message. And finally, the liquidity is, of course, also important. If there's too much liquidity, which can always replace their vested funds, the social tipping will also be not effective. So the large liquidity in financial markets is also a problem for the divestment campaign, as we can see from this model. Now, first wrap up on social tipping points here. The dynamics of social change in the form of tipping dynamics that could be key for triggering rapid decarbonization and sustainability transition. They are certainly involved in relevant human Earth system interactions and feedbacks, and there have been first steps collecting empirical data on this and modeling, but much work remains to be done. A lot of uncertainties, even up to the point that it remains to be shown that these dynamics are actually kind of can happen in the real world, and also identifying much more relevant options how they could be triggered and managed and governed because they could, of course, also be turned into very dark, used in very dark ways if these things would be understood very well. Just think of things like social engineering, etc. Now, finally, I want to give some final words on this overall perspective of whole Earth system analysis in which this is embedded. We have to go, because we are in the Anthropocene, Earth system analysis needs to go from this Bretherton perspective, which is purely biophysical, with a very small box describing human behavior, to an updated view on Earth system dynamics, which includes the Anthroposphere as an equal part in the Earth system. And this is only starting now. There's a community effort, and we are part of that, and others too, many others too, but this is only starting. Whole Earth system analysis, as we do it at PIC, I think it's additionally, it's not only looking into human Earth system interactions and dynamics, but also combining this with complex systems analysis. And so, and tipping points are a key concept in social, in complex systems. So that's why I think it's just something that I like to do a lot, because it brings together my main interests, and it's also, I think, very timely to do that. The closing the loop again is the perspective of reconnecting human dynamics to Earth system science beyond mainstream economics, beyond what the integrated assessment modelers are already doing, and key perspectives on human agency, transformation, transdisciplinary perspectives, and co-evolutionary dynamics have to be taken into account. As we've discussed a lot in this Loops workshop series, there will be follow-ups of that soon. And yeah, we have built this World Earth modeling framework to build models where that we can use to study these complex systems. And now a lot of my research is also targeted together with Johan Rockström and others, to this concept of Earth system resilience, where it's really about using these tools and concepts to understand how the system, the overall Earth system can be managed by Earth system stewardship to avoid hothouse Earth trajectories. So to go to pathway number 2 down here instead of pathway number 1 up there. And in final summary, I hope I made the case that it's quite important to study the dynamics of climate tipping elements under global warming, because they have very large potential impacts on human societies, that a lot of them are kind of long-term commitments, but they come on top of the more frequent and more severe extreme events, etc., that we will experience already very soon, or are already experiencing. The interactions of climate tipping elements and the risk of dangerous emerging cascading dynamics are still understudied and even less understood than the individual tipping elements. So much more work remains to be done here, including the complex Earth system models. And finally, also, of course, the opportunities of positive social tipping points for global sustainability and their interactions with the climate change dynamics needs to be studied much further. Not the least also, I mean, of course, including simulations models, but also including much more elaborate behavioral experiments, for example. And with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to some questions, I hope.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this overview. Yeah, if you have questions, either raise your hand or let me know in the chat. I think Jaap, you can go first.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your talk. It's quite worrying what you discussed. I had a few questions. So I was wondering, you mentioned in your talk that the ice sheet of Antarctica is relatively stable over the last million years. So what makes it unstable now? Because so apparently it was also stable during the last ice ages, so and interglacials. So what explains its current instability?
Yes, good question. It's the thing is that the past during the past millions of years, basically since the main bulk of the Antarctic ice sheet has been established. That is really paleoclimatologists and geologists estimate that the Antarctic ice sheet has been around really for 20 to 30 million years before before present. And the thing is that since this is the case, that the global mean surface temperature hasn't been above 2 to maybe 2.5 degrees, say, for what we know. So these levels of where also the threshold of the Paris Climate Agreement, the target range of the Paris Climate Agreement is, this is also the geological corridor that the Earth system has evolved in within the past 30 million years. And during past interglacials, for example, so past warm periods of the past, let's say, million years, the climate has been sometimes as warm as it is today because of global anthropogenic global warming. So, for example, the interglacial 100,000 years ago, which is called the Eemian, after this, I think it's in Netherlands, a river called Eem.
Yep.
It's named after that. So the Eemian interglacial has been as warm as we have it today, or even a bit warmer, but it has never been as warm as it could be by the end of the century. So that's why the Antarctic ice sheet hasn't experienced these levels of forcing, and it has always been debated whether it would be stable under these larger forcings or not. But now there's increasing evidence, including our work, this paper that I presented, that this is not the case. That it's actually there are these large thresholds, and yeah. So that's the and of course ice ages, there it's much colder, so they are even stabilizing the Antarctic ice sheet. They're not destabilizing it, right?
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one more question?
Yes, a quick one, and then we go next.
So I was wondering, you're mainly focusing on temperature in climate change, but don't you think that so CO2 itself might be a major impact factor in climate change? For example, there's a theory that increasing CO2 levels could decrease the Amazon forest with disastrous results. Because it decreases evaporation in the Amazon forest. Don't you think you have to include this in the models to understand the impact of climate change?
It's true that so for this analysis of the climate tipping points, what we usually do for these summary figures and the analysis of, for example, the tipping cascades, we like to bring everything on the same scale, and that's why we basically convert the thresholds of the tipping elements to units of global mean surface temperature. So, but of course, the impacts of climate change, they are not just via temperature, but also, as you say, via increased levels of greenhouse gases, for example, but also one shouldn't, because of that, of course, we have strong ocean acidification, which is another huge, also underrated problem, but also, of course, large changes in precipitation pattern and other climate patterns. So it's really, and this is considered also in the models. But one should mention, of course, there are uncertainties, and I think things like CO2 fertilization and other effects of basically physiological effects that different CO2 levels have on plant physiology, they are still under study a lot. So there's, particularly for longer term climate change, basically beyond 2100, this can have a huge impact, basically because it's for example not very well constrained how strong the effects of CO2 fertilization are actually. And this is the current analysis show, also my colleagues are working on that this is not likely to have a strong impact for the climate change in this century, but after that, after 2100, it could have a big effect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Han, take it away.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And I'm especially interested in the social modeling, and especially the ones where you use the Cus catastrophe in the nodes of a social network. I made a similar model that I will send you a paper on later, but I focus a lot also on polarization in this case. So the fact that we have people that want to change. I have a positive idea, of course, about climate, but we also have a contra effect that are lots of people now denying climate. This polarization effect can also easily be modeled using these nonlinear Gus-like patterns in individuals. Is this something that you worked on or thought about?
The polarization, you mean?
polarization in the sense that we get the division of opinions that increases. That's of course also happens in the climate debate. So that's actually something that is very important in changing people behavior in this case. And this is of course not good news. And that's also an effect that probably can be modeled.
Yeah, exactly. So I have worked a little bit with polarization models, but more generally, not in the climate context. And I'm aware of a lot of work in social simulation and sociology, etc. of this. So this is, I think, a very important point, that it's particularly when the interest is in understanding how issues like general political polarization and things like the rise of fake news and conspiracy theories, etc., interact with the awareness of global warming, or the willingness to act on global warming. I think this is key to include these processes, and this is certainly a deficiency of these simple social contagion models, like this extended granometer model, that they don't have this dynamics in them. They don't have these processes. They basically have a spreading process of one trait, but there's nothing that causes polarization. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Stefano, and then I also have a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. First of all, thank you very much. It was a really brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is, if you can please explain a little bit more into detail how the assumptions of your computational model can shape those social tipping points that you were showing in divestment. Thank you.
Yeah, so on the divestment model, so this is really a let me jump to that quickly. So this is really a quite conceptual model, right? So we were really interested in principle, if we put dynamics like this social learning and also homophily between investors regarding whether they are socially responsible or not, and coupling this to a financial market, whether this can lead to a divestment tipping point like behavior in the model. So this is of course it's very stylized, and there are a lot of uncertainties and even structural kind, of course. And what we try to do in this analysis is we try to cover quite a broad range of different parameters. So, for example, I mean, varying things like the social interaction frequency, the trading frequency, liquidity, share of socially responsible investors. Basically, we varied all the parameters, then we can make these qualitative statements that under does the likelihood of a social tipping point increase or decrease if a certain parameter is increased, like the liquidity, for example. These are the types of statements that we were making. But there are, of course, if the model was to be improved, there are many ways of doing that, many ways to start. I mean, one thing that is particularly unrealistic in this model is that there's just one single representative for the fuel firm, for example, right? And also that we don't have, we just have private investors here, and we don't have the effect of government investors, which are actually it's quite a large share of fossil fuel companies are owned by governments, and they cannot be really changed by the types of dynamics that we are covering in this model. So their investments, there's other processes which determine whether a government will basically, let's say the Chinese government will close down their carbon power plants. This doesn't depend on financial markets, at least not directly, as we model it here, right? So there are a lot of these types of things which we don't have in the model. But there's also this, like, if you want to look into this in a bit more detail, there's this archive preprint on this, and I'm also happy to answer more questions by email also.
Thank you once again. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there are no questions currently, I have one. So the tipping elements you talked about defined, to occur when there's a certain threshold being passed, right? So you go beyond some global mean temperature, and then it might tip. So it's kind of bifurcation induced tipping. Then later you talked about noise induced tipping. So for example, say you're not at the tipping point, but then just some shock happens and then you crash into the other equilibrium. Now I remember, and this is a while ago, that there's also what's called rate induced tipping. So where you somehow the environment changes too quickly for the system to reach equilibrium in time, and then the system might tip, even though it doesn't reach the bifurcation, the selenol bifurcation. There's something like compost bomb instability or something like that. But is there a problem? So for example, also the planetary boundaries, most are defined with respect to thresholds. But given that, the temperature, as you showed in the first graph, is actually changing rapidly, so the rate is changing dramatically. Is there an issue, or can we rule this kind of tipping out for most of these elements?
Very good point. So rate-induced tipping is quite, in that sense, it's quite a risky process that is also is not in many cases it's not well understood, but there's increasing evidence that it can factor in tipping elements in the climate system, even where this hasn't been previously or it has been previously maybe conjectured, but it hasn't been shown very clearly. But now there just has been 1-2 weeks ago a paper by the group of Peter Ditlevsen, and they have shown using a kind of a really high resolution climate model that rate-induced tipping can happen for the AMOC, for the Atlantic overturning circulation. And this is something that this is of course something to look into much more in the future. I agree, and also like you say, these policy concepts like the Paris, the Paris temperature goals and the planetary boundaries, they focus just on the state of the system, but not on the rates of change. And this is of course potentially they would have to be extended if in the future, including this. I know, but this is an anecdote, but I know that John Schellnhuber and his colleagues in the 90s, when they introduced the concepts on they called it the tolerable windows approach, and that was kind of what was building the conceptual foundation of the tipping points work, and also the Paris part of the Paris framework, actually, at least in a theoretical way. They were also considering thresholds in global warming, but also in the rate of warming. But then later, the rate was thrown out because it was too complicated for the politicians. Right. So this is quite funny in a way.
Yeah, interesting. You said Ditlevsen recently has a paper on this. You mentioned, or is that the? Yeah, that I'm gonna look this up. Yeah, that's
PNAS 2021. Then you find it. Peter Ditlevsen from Copenhagen University.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I can shoot another one, but I don't want to. Han van der Maas raised his hand again. Is that true, Han?
No, it was still there.
Okay. Yeah, then I'll go, and then maybe somebody else has one. So you talked about briefly, but I actually read this paper in the morning about the Copan-Core modeling, where you sort of try to build into the sociocultural dynamics more into sort of the whole Earth system framework. So I guess I have two questions. One is just on the sociology of how that endeavor works. I mean, are you calling in economists and sociologists, and then you chat, and then you develop that? What are the challenges there? And the other one, I mean, I think you hinted it at the end, is how would you even try to calibrate this? Like, how would you even begin to think of, how do changes in the social sphere, impact the climate and vice versa, where this is exactly what we're trying to find out, right? In terms of the real trajectory we're taking.
Yeah, so for designing the research or performing the research, designing the research team, etc., it's I think increasingly I found that, I mean, there's a truly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaboration needed, and I'm quite, I think, in a lucky position at PIC, but also in collaboration with the colleagues here. Some of them are here actually from Princeton and the Stockholm Resilience Center to have this really great opportunity to be able to work quite closely with people who are, from social psychology, sociology, political science, etc., to develop these things. And I think it's key that we don't there was a tendency in some, at least in our group for some time, that it was a lot physicists doing this kind of modeling like physicists do, right, but with a not too strong connection to the social sciences. But this is something that I think we are getting over this slowly and trying at least, and other groups, I think there's also new institutes which are planned, research institutes which are planned, which are going in this direction, with really integrating humanities, social science and natural science for addressing Anthropocene climate change problems, and I think this is really the way to go. I think it's quite challenging to the skill set of people that are needed in these projects. Is really something that's very hard to get, right? So it's very, if you want to hire a modeler, a lot of them come from physics or some quantitative discipline, or maybe computer science, but then they don't understand the social science theories, or they are not, or some people maybe come from the social sciences, but then they are not so interested in integrating environmental or climate processes into their models. So there's always these challenges, and part of it is of course trying to train people in students and PhD students to in this space, and this is also something that we are trying to do, of course. And but it remains challenging, yeah. And that was just the first part, I think, of your question, right? And the second was about calibrating, right? So the calibration, very briefly, I think, of course, there are huge uncertainties. It's not possible to calibrate, I think, to calibrate these social dynamics models as to calibrate a climate model, like using satellite data and trying to really reproduce the development of the past 100 years, and then you are confident about the next decade. This is not how it works, but there is a way always to. That's why I like these more simple models, because you can try to sample all these uncertainties using Monte Carlo approaches, for example, and do some statistical analysis of these results using concepts from statistical physics, for example. So that's one thing to deal with it. And the other is, of course, really trying to constrain the parameters more. And there's some great work, by this paper by Beckett et al. 2018 in Nature Climate Change, where they combined a very simple model of social, behavioral change with a climate model. And they had this co-evolutionary loop that they studied, and they based on the theory of plant behavior. So that was not based on the standard macroeconomic paradigm like the hothouse, the DICE model, which is always used otherwise, but it was really another kind of a more modern model theory of plant behavior. And I think they also constrain parameters, and this is a way to go. And finally, of course, I really think behavioral experiments and to try to do behavioral experiments within a realistic or climate environment. And this is I can advertise this a bit. This is something we're developing actually with a company which is called Skiara, and we are developing a tool to be able to run these experiments. And you can also look at the website. I'm just posting the link in the chat. This is something that I hope this type of approach. So it's like a massive multiplayer approach of doing behavioral experiments, participatory simulation experiments with people in this climate context. This might enable us to understand, things like social tipping dynamics also in a more empirical way in the future, if we get funding for this. we have crowdfunding, but we need more.
Yeah, excellent. What was, just quickly, what was the reference you gave to the Nature paper 2018?
It's Nature Climate Change. I can also write this Beckett, Brian Beckett, et al. 2018 Nature Climate Change. It's a great paper. Yeah, excellent. But it's also just the beginning. It's a much the behavioral model that they have is extremely simple, and the climate model that they have is also very simple. But it's one of the first papers in this space that really makes this next step, you know.
Yeah. No, excellent. I mean, I'm in a psychology department, so I like it when physicists say that we need to connect with human dynamics and so on and so on. So that's very good. Okay, are there any other questions? If not,
Yes, I would have one.
definitely, yeah, go ahead.
Would like to ask if it is possible to watch again the talk somehow. Is there any recording in the future? Or is it possible to have the slides, or I don't know, whatever?
Yeah, maybe you missed it. We have a website. I'm just gonna put it in the chat as well, where we upload all the past events, and there you'll find a recording by next week. And if Jonathan, you could send me the slides as well, I can upload them. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you for this.
No, excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. This was amazing. A lot of information, very inspiring, good stuff.